But personally, I was never happy than when I was on tour and playing live. I absolutely love it. You don't think about anything else. You're just completely submerged in the moment. You're interacting with other people and what they're doing, so you're listening to everything that other people are doing, particularly if it's music you really like. It's just an incredible feeling.
Genevieve McGuckin.
Yes.
Welcome to the Australian Music Vault.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, Genevieve, I was hoping we could start with your first live music experience ever as a punter, as someone going to see live music.
That was seeing the Rolling Stones at the Milton Tennis Courts in 1972. Yeah, my older sister and I was 14, maybe 15. We had tickets. And I wasn't like a huge Rolling Stones fan, but I was a Keith Richards fan for some reason. I've always been attracted to degenerate types, no. But yeah, I went and it was wonderful. I loved it. You know, I sort of thought it was hilarious with all the jumpsuits and whatever, but he threw rose petals out into the audience and I was up near the front and I was just sort of like the spectacle and the noise was just wonderful. I was just completely lost and I was catching rose petals and I kept those rose petals in a little box for, quite a while. I put them in the box and then carried the box around the world and opened it up one day and there was nothing in there. Yeah, I don't know. They just faded into ash. But that was my first ever, concert. And it was like, well, there was 8,000 people. And I was wearing some stupid Australian Army hat that I'd found in an op shop and a purple smock with flower pots on it. I'll always remember that. Very strangely dressed. But I thought that I liked Keith Richards because he'd been cheeky to the interviewer on a program called GTK. But when I got there was someone playing the piano called Nicky Hopkins, and I kept looking at him all the time. I thought Mick Jagger was a bit of a ponce. You know, he was so obviously in love with himself. But, you know, that it was a spectacle and it was amazing music. You know, it was good. It wasn't the sort of music I loved, but, you know, the songs were great. Well, my favourite Australian artists were the Saints. I saw them at Queensland University in 1973, it was. And it was an amazing gig and I'd never seen anything like it. And it was the first time I ever heard music live that was like music that was catchy, interesting. The boys were scary, but I really liked it. It was the first time I'd ever seen, you know, electric guitar played in a way that I really liked from music. And but they got really drunk and ended up jumping in the swimming pool. And Brisbane University is on the river and, you know, it's about half a mile down to the river itself. Jeffrey apparently was trying to evade the police and he ran down there and then swam across the river. Yeah, I would never have gone up and spoken to them or anything, you know. And they looked dangerous to me, you know. They looked like if you did go up and speak to them, you'd either get a gruff sort of put down or, you know, get spun away with them or, who knows. But something dangerous might happen. That was what I remember thinking at the time. But I loved it and it was exciting. Their house in Brisbane had beer bottles all over the front of it. And it sort of, I don't know how they balanced, but it was totally covered in beer bottles. So, you know, that didn't endear me to them personally, individually. So I didn't get to know them until later. I left Brisbane when I left home when I was 16 and I left Brisbane quite early. So There wasn't really any other bands up there that I liked. The Go-Betweens hadn't started yet. There was a band called Zero that my older sister took me to see, that Lindy was a drummer in, and I quite liked them. But, yeah, I didn't really go out to see bands very much. There was something heavy in Brisbane. I used to feel like on the weekends that there was the sound of motor mowers and the racing on the radio, and it just felt like nothing would ever happen. And I wanted to have adventures. I wanted to, find new things. And I'd been learning guitar, and I played Spanish guitar, and I wanted my own guitar. And if I wanted my own guitar, I had to pay for it. So my sister and I went out to the Golden Circle Pineapple Cannery. I lied about my age, said I was 16 when I was only 15. And we worked in this hellhole of a place for 3 months. And I saved up enough to buy my first guitar to get my grandfather's old fiddle fixed and to get to Melbourne. But it was just this incredible place. It just was, we thought it was like a gulag or something. We'd go there and we'd sing really loud Velvet Underground songs and no one could hear. And we were in lines covered in this horrible pink lotion to stop pineapple rash. Everything stunk of really hot pineapples and they just kept coming at you along a thing, and they'd been cored and skinned, but there was still burrs all over them, and we had these big knives strapped onto us and we were just like going like this all day. It was just incredible. And then there'd be blood in the can, blood in the can. They'd have to stop. I don't know how we did it. So there was a couple of months where we actually worked from 7:30 in the morning until 11 at night to get overtime. The guitar I bought was a beautiful guitar, but it was more like a classical or Spanish guitar than it was. It was handmade. It was a nylon string, but it was just beautiful. It sounded amazing. And I also bought an old Epiphone acoustic that had F-holes in it, and that was a steel string. And I didn't know it was a gem, but when I got to Melbourne, everyone was like, oh, my God, where did you get that? And apparently it was made in 1930. A mixture of things. I think my father loved music, used to wake us up with music every morning. And he always regretted that he'd never learnt an instrument, so he was very encouraging about music. And when I played piano, he'd come and sit next to me, and that was one of the few times that, we ever, because I had a huge family, that, you had one-on-one time with someone. And I just loved the sound of guitar and the shape and, holding it. And you can move around if you want. And I really don't know what it was. It was a whole mixture of things. And I wanted to do what boys did. I wanted to see if I could. I was a bit of a tomboy. I wouldn't have called myself a tomboy, but Harry said I was a tomboy. I dressed in boys' clothes. I was quite androgynous looking. I had shortish hair. Not always too short, but it got shorter as time. I wore men's trousers sort of cinched up the waist with a big safety pin, and men's shirts, but good shirts. So I had a certain taste in a good shirt, which I think, particularly shirts with lots of checking of silk and ones with gold thread in them. And I wore noisy shoes. I loved noisy shoes. So I used to get golfing shoes or bowling shoes with metal studs on the bottom so that I made a big noise when I walked. And that made me feel more confident, I think. Because I was a little thing. And, Yeah, I had a friend called Murray Hoy who I met when I first came to Melbourne, and she was amazing. And I didn't really know very many people yet. I met this wonderful girl who was a costume person on the Sullivans, and I moved in with her. And then I went out to see a band, and I didn't like the band, but they were playing Bowie afterwards, and I was dancing around with my eyes shut, and suddenly there's a girl in front of me, and she sort of kissed me and said, "You're fantastic." And then, not sexually, and we just became really good friends. And I sort of got into the Melbourne punk scene with her. Okay. Basically, we were a bit of a duo. Well, it was quite wonderful. I think many people in this particular area of music were people that had never fitted in anywhere before. We had very strong taste, perhaps, like I loved Leonard Cohen and Patti Smith and the Stooges and David Bowie, and I'd never really met other people who liked my taste in music, and so, you know, people would think you were always the weirdo, you know, the weird one who wore weird clothes, and nobody really knew, you know, what you were or anything. And then there was suddenly there were bands playing music that was more like, you know, the Saints, or more like New York sort of punk. And there was suddenly, you'd go to, you know, the first time I ever saw a group of other people that all looked interesting was going to, you know, the first punk dunk gig. And it was on the footpath in Carlton. And I remember just sitting there thinking, oh, God, who's that? Who's that? And, you know, having sort of crushes on everybody all over the place. It was great. And it was like finally, yeah, we found a tribe, you know, and there were some amazing people in there. And I still feel sort of blessed, you know, that I've managed to fall into this area. And it was also, Murray sang and I played guitar, and we had a fictional band where, you know, I think we had 3 songs or something and never really played. Murray would get up and sing. She was gorgeous as well, which didn't hurt. The other girls thought we were sort of toughies, which is funny to think of now. But just because of the way we dressed, and we wore a lot of sort of ripped up finery, you know, and but we had an attitude, I guess. Murray had a sneer, which was quite scary, but she was gorgeous. It was good getting to know people who were interested in you and you were interested in them, and you'd feed off, you'd show them what you'd discovered and they'd show you what they'd discovered, and it was just this big circle of inspiration. I'd always loved St Kilda. I'd lived in St Kilda when I first came to Melbourne by myself, and I loved the East European sort of fug, smoke everywhere, people speaking other languages, lots of conversation, lots of people in the street. It was so different from Brisbane or anything that I'd experienced, and I loved the buildings. So Murray and I used to, you know, go down there and explore. And then I think there was a band called The Moths with Stuart and Dave Light, and they had a house in Lock Street, I think, or Park Street, and they had a great party there. And then after that, Murray and I thought, yeah, we're going to live there. Because we also weren't living together yet. We thought, let's go get a flat together. And we got one in St Leonard's Avenue, and it was called Del Marie. So we thought, oh, yeah, that's made to be. It was $11 a week. It looked like a ship. It was Art Deco with rounded windows and across the road from a church. And, yeah, I just loved it. And so that was probably late 77. There were lots of parties, lots of gigs. So you'd go to parties, you'd see people there. There was a group of people that consisted of Rowland and Ollie Olsen and Nick Haven and Nita Lane and Bronwyn Bonnie and Lisa Craswell, and they looked incredible. And I used to see them, and I started going to see the Boys Next Door at the Tiger Lounge, and I'd always see Rowland zipping through the crowd. But yeah, I met Nick after a gig at the Tiger Lounge, and Nick was very charismatic. He was intelligent, funny, artistic. He knew a lot about books, and we shared a lot of tastes. He could be quite narcissistic at times, but he had a feeling, I think, that he was going somewhere. I think he was gathering influences from everybody around, as everybody does. It seems ridiculous now, it's only 2 or 3 weeks, but by then I was sort of quite, he just stayed at my place all that time. So I was quite sort of, smitten. And so we kept seeing each other. And then Anita sort of moved into my place, which was very odd to be around. And then, it was all very complicated. And then she moved in down the road. Her brother got a flat down the road. And yes, it was a very incestuous sort of little group of people. And Rowland and I, meanwhile, Rowland was a person I went to talk about how I felt, to talk about Nick, to talk about music. He was always concerned with how I was, and if Nick was drunk, how I was getting home. And he was lovely. But he was only 16 or 17. And, when you're 2 years older than someone, you think that they're so young, it could never be. And then Mick Harvey and Rowland moved I moved out into another flat, and Rowland and Mick Harvey moved in with me. Meanwhile, Nick and I had fallen apart, and he was back with Anita. And Rowland kept telling me that, he was in love with me. And I thought, no, it's just another teenage crush. And I said, no, I'm not sure how I feel. I don't want to be in another relationship yet. And I made him wait, but it was probably only a month or 2. I went to Sydney and went to a Laughing Clowns rehearsal, which was amazing. Stayed with Simon Bonney from Crime and City Solution. And got back to Melbourne and just realised I really, really missed Rowland. We were sitting on a pier, looking out over the sea, talking, and I was sort of a bit depressed. And he said, I know what you should do. And I said, what? And he said, draw. So we went back to my place and got all my crayons out, started doing millions of drawings and putting them up on the wall. And then the lights went, and he was standing on top of a stool on top of my table, and I was holding onto his legs and looking up, and I thought, I don't know if it was a handyman thing, but I just thought, oh my God, I really, really love this person. And that was wonderful. It was just, it was really blissful. Rowland was in a wonderful band called the Young Charlatans, who were my favourite band in Melbourne. They were brilliant. I liked them much better than the Boys Next Door. They were really unusual, and the music was catchy. And it was with Ollie Olsen, and both Ollie and Rowland sang. And Rowland sang Shivers because he'd already written that. They were both incredibly charismatic. Janine, who later played with the Saints, was playing bass, and Jeffrey Wagner, who'd been with the Saints, was playing drums. And they were just incredible. But because Rowland and Ollie were such strong personalities, Ollie was always leaving the band. And they played 13 times, I think. It seems like a million, but yeah, it was only 13 times. And so I used to go there. And then Roland was Nick's friend, and so wherever I went, there was this group of people. And Roland he was just so easy to talk to. He was funny. He was wry. Yeah, he was insightful. He was interested, and very interesting. And he loved sharing everything he'd discovered. And so I showed him all my weird French New Wave books, and he got me onto Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and, Nina Simone. And yeah, so it was, and he was gorgeous. Roland and I started playing music together as soon as we moved in together. I had a piano, he had a guitar. I used to, just make up things on the piano, and he'd come and listen. Sometimes he'd play. We'd show each other things that we'd written. So we played together a lot at home. And when we moved in together on our own without Mick Harvey, I had this old reel-to-reel machine that was actually for mixing 4-track down to 2-track. And it had this sound on sound button. And so you could just sort of fool it into recording, track over track over track and just building up this big wall of sound. And that's when Roland really got into the idea of sound, that it's not what you play on the guitar, it's how you make it sound and what sounds you can make. And it was like a whole new world, and he was so good at it. Well, I was playing guitar when I met Roland, and he actually said that he really was influenced by my guitar playing, which I think is hilarious. I don't think he was. But I did have a quirky sort of way of playing guitar when I wrote songs. But when he and Mick Harvey moved in and I bought myself an old piano, I started playing the piano. I got a bit overwhelmed, I think, at the rate, because they were playing in a band, the rate at which they were, getting better was, and, at that age, they were just sort of, Roland especially was taking off. And in the end, I thought, oh, God, I'll leave that to him. I'll just play something else. Yeah, and I always wrote songs, but I couldn't sing. But I would write the words, and Roland really liked what I did, and that meant a lot to me. But I didn't have that sort of... I've got stacks of confidence if I'm just playing, an instrument on stage, but I'm not a front person. No, just too shy. And he was my big encourager. He was always saying, Jen, you're great. You've got to do something. Don't be ridiculous. Because I had a sort of problem of belief, I guess. And it was wonderful. I loved it. Playing in These Immortal Souls, we were sort of unfashionable at the time. We've got much groovier since. I got some money for my 18th birthday, or one of those birthdays. And I also had been working a lot, and I thought, okay, I'm going to buy a guitar. And I went in to Clemens, which was an old music shop in Russell Street, and bought myself a Fender Jaguar. It was a sunburst one, not white one. And it turned out to be Ollie's guitar. He'd pawned it. So I ended up with Ollie's guitar. So it was very incestuous in all ways, this group of people. And Roland really liked the Fender Jaguar and the sound. And then I think Keith Glass says that he gave Roland the money, but I remember giving Roland the money for the guitar. We went into Clemens again in the city, and there was a white Jaguar right up on the ceiling, and these grumpy old men that ran the shop said, we're not taking it down unless you promise to buy it. And he said, okay. and it was $450. I mean, it was like half a year's rent, so, or 2 years' rent or something. It was a big deal, but he had it ever after. Yeah. Some guitarists collect guitars. Rowland was a minimalist, I think. He found one instrument that he really liked, and that was enough. And he used to laugh. We'd have support bands, and they'd have sort of 8 guitars and, 50 pedals, and he'd sort of chuckle. He wasn't interested in muso-hood, people talking guitars or people talking pedals or amps or anything like that. He liked, Fender Twin, reverb, amp, a blue box and a distortion pedal, and that's all he needed, a tremolo arm. And, yeah. It's a wonder the guitar's still with us, really, because he pawned it quite a few times. I got it out quite a few times. Yeah, I've bought that guitar about 5 times. But I used to get furious, and he pawned it, and he was so stressed. But yeah, such as I don't know how to describe Rowland's sound. It might be indescribable. It was different things. It was like the guitar was plugged right into his soul. It was just, he could make noises, and it wasn't just a noise, it was what he played, how he played, things he did with harmonics, and it would just build in a way, and then there'd be this jagged, chord that would rip through you. And he didn't think about what he was doing. It was just all, he just could, one of those people that's so lucky they can just pick up an instrument and they're in another he's in another state, You couldn't talk to him. You get that sort of stare where he'd look like over the heads of everybody. And he went into some sort of dreamscape or something. But everyone says that his sound is, completely unlike anybody else's. And when we met people in America like Sonic Youth, and they were all really, stunned at what he did with the guitar. It was great. But it was a growing sound. It wasn't one thing. Someone's put out a Rowland S. Howard pedal that's supposed to make you sound like Rowland. And it does, but they don't realise that you have to sort of feel like Rowland, and you have to play like Rowland, and you have to think like Rowland. Yeah. And it's no use sounding like a certain thing, if you're playing some rubbish. It was a white Fender Jaguar, and in about the second year he had it, he found a rose sticker. It's never as big as I think when I see it. It's probably only about this big. And he put that on his guitar, and his guitar is all, it's got belt buckle marks all over it, and it's, the sticker's scratched, and it just looks amazing. And it was so identifiable because of the rose. It was just like Rowland. And he wrote a book, and the main character was called Rose Thorn. And there were always red roses growing just for him in his songs. They weren't just sort of pretty romantic roses. They were, thorns and as well, always. Love and heartbreak. Boys Next Door they became the birthday party in London, but they knew that they were getting to be sort of, medium-sized fish in a very small pond, and everyone always wanted to explore. We always wanted to see what was to offer, what was there on the other side of the world, what adventures we could have, what other bands were like. And so the boys decided to relocate to London, and the girlfriends just sort of went as well. I went to London in February 1980, a couple of weeks after Rowland. There were no telephones, mobile phones, so he'd said that he'd leave a message for me at Australia House to tell me where he was living, because someone had said that's what you could do. And I went to Australia House, and this nice man who worked the lift said, no, you can't do that. And so for about a week, I used to go to Piccadilly and look around and hope that I'd see Rowland. And eventually, Rowland and Nick rang their manager in Australia, and I managed to get through to him and found out where they were. The first place where I found Rowland finally, he was in a flat in Earls Court, and there was Tracy and Phil and Mick and Nick and Anita and Katie, and everybody was in this one-bedroom flat, and Phil and Mick had 2 single beds in the bedroom. Rowland and I slept on the couch. Nick slept in the hallway, the entrance bit. And there were 10 of us in this tiny little flat. And the landlord came over one day unexpectedly and just started saying, you are barbarians, we do not live like this. And we were barbarians. Yeah. So then we got a house in Fulham and Maxwell Road, and again, Tracy slept on the stairs often. It only had 2 bedrooms. Rowland and I had a bedroom, and Mick and Katie had a bedroom, so that was nice. I don't know why we were so lucky. And then it became difficult to pay rent after that. We got broker and broker in London because there was no money coming in, and, we were all the girls were doing rotten jobs, or, getting paid, £2.50 an hour. And Rowland and I got some work at a clothing Topshop factory outside London. And we're through an agency, and we went out there one morning, and they had me gunning prices onto clothes and Rowland doing something, I forget what, and he just kept looking at me over the thing. And then at morning tea, he asked someone how much we got paid, and they said it was £28 a week. And so we ran away. We just left after morning tea, and we were miles, or we'd been driven in a van. We were miles from anywhere. It took us about 2 days to get home. But, yeah, so compared to our lives in Australia, it was really, really hard. And I think that's probably where the drug use sort of took over, because it was cheaper than alcohol. Surprisingly enough, not like in Australia, it was really cheap. And it kept you warm, and you stopped being hungry, So I think that probably helped it stop being a sort of once a month party thing into a more common sort of. Somewhere, I think in 1978, Mick first put the question to Rowland whether he would play with them. They really liked him as a person. They liked his guitar playing. And the Young Charlatans had stopped playing. So Rowland said, yeah, okay, as long as I can write songs and sing. They wanted, to go to another level, I think. And Rowland wrote a different sort of songs, and they really liked the Young Charlatans. And, yeah, they just thought they'd be good for each other, I think. And they were, I think Rowland probably would have done something wonderful anyway, but I think the addition of Rowland made so much difference. They were a completely different band. And Nick said that. He said that, Rowland was a transforming influence in his life, and they went from being a sort of more basic punk rock sort of band into being, something more interesting, complex. Mm. Oh yes, there's some quirky guitar. I think I wrote a song that was used on the first birthday party record that was called, I wrote the music to Yo Ho Hole, it's called. And then I'd written this bizarre sort of bit of prose or whatever that was called Capers. And Nick and Rowland rang me up from Australia at Christmas when they'd come back and said, can we use that Capers thing? I was like, really? And they said, yeah, can we use it in the song? And I thought, oh my God. Okay, so it's a bit embarrassing to have that as a song. My first, words in print were this just sort of nonsense stuff. And it ended up with something. I had a dreadful die hood thanks to my Fafa family. And so it really upset my parents because I didn't sort of see it like that. And I sort of said, look, I'm on this record. And they were like really horrified. Well, I mean, the birthday party were playing. They had a publicist, Chris Carr. There was sort of interest, but the first reviews were crazy. They talk about cork hats and kangaroos. They were nothing to do with what they were like. It was just this, everyone would get stuck on the Australian thing. And the English were really unfriendly, The boys were still playing gigs. And then they went to America. And a journalist called Barney Hopkins went with them. And while they were in America, he was writing about them. And when they got back, they sort of became huge in America. They played one night and they were, the power was pulled. They were accused of, sort of all sorts of crimes against, sound and nature, and word spread, and everybody wanted to come and see them. So by the third gig in New York, there were people around the block trying to get in. And when they got back, there was huge reviews and Sounds and NME, and all of a sudden they were, the best thing since Jesus Christ, said Barney Hopkins. Or since the crucifixion, I think he said. When people went to see them, I think it was pretty equal billing, Nick and Rowland. The reviews all had photos of Nick and Rowland. When they'd interview them, they'd ask for Nick's favourite things and Rowland's favourite things. So it was sort of like the Glimmer Twins or something. It was, very much sort of the two of them. Because they were unlike anything around at the time, absolutely different. And I think that was also something really good about Melbourne and starting in Melbourne was that in those days we didn't have telephones, we didn't have anything. If you went to someone's house and they weren't home, people would do collages on other people's doors, and you had time to develop. You weren't in the public eye, so you had time to develop your own style. You couldn't buy clothes at Vivienne Westwood's shop, so you had to sort of make your own. So it was different, style was different, the way people dressed was different, the way they worked was different, and the way they sounded was different. And so I think having come from Melbourne, they had that sort of roots in that, and that stood them in really good stead. And then the sort of bleakness of life and the reality of life in London and freezing and starving and made them get really sort of, that sort of more dangerous element that they had. And Rowland just made incredible noise, and it was beautiful noise. And he wrote songs, he wrote music. Nick wrote words. Sometimes Nick, they both wrote whole songs and half songs together. So, he was really important to the birthday party. Well, it got more difficult as time went on because he didn't think Nick credited him, you know, with, because the songwriting process, Nick started wanting to write all the songs. You know, as happens. And Rowland would think that Nick would have a little, you know, skeleton of an idea, and Rowland would write it, but Nick would say he wrote the song, and, you know, but Rowland wanted to do his own songs, but because he couldn't sing them, he started writing different sort of songs, you know, not his heartbreak songs, but yeah. So it got to be, everybody loved the pair of them, but their relationship, you know, Rowland got hurt by thing. I think, you know, like a lot of musicians have, they don't have a lot of defences to the world, you know. They have to feel their feelings in order to write music and to write words that are good, and they have to make themselves open, but then they also, you know, get hurt by each other. And I think Nick's quite competitive. Rowland always wrote everything down as if for posterity, like right from when he wrote Shivers, when he was 16. It's dated, it's signed, you know, the day that it was written. It's written out beautifully. Then he'd, you know, have books where he scribbles, you know, 20 verses or something, which would go down to 3. And then he'd write them out again sometimes. So there was a 3, but there's also notebooks full of, he just wrote all the time. He just piles and piles of writing. 3 unpublished novels, which probably should be, you know, should be published. And just, yeah, his brain was always going, his mind was always creating. And so, you know, there's just these wonderful notebooks full of thoughts and, you know, full of lists of things, books he likes, you know, what he'd say if he met Tom Waits. Book reviews. He wrote book reviews for a while for the Herald Sun. We got weird reviews. One which referred to Rowland as a bandicoot, said he looked like a bandicoot and he sang like a bandicoot, and that I was a goth because I had a crucifix on in the photo, and I didn't look anything like a goth, and I would hate to be called a goth. And Rowland and Nick never wanted to be goths. I mean, people have accused Nick of starting goth and having goth hair, and he's got a lot of goth fans, but we never liked goth, you know. We just thought it was just so, you know, conformist, yeah, I think. You didn't want to be really classifiable, I suppose, as anything. But, yes, we were horrified. But we were saved because our first gig was with Sonic Youth, and they really liked us, and they always gave us their support. So the first time I played a big live show that wasn't at the Crystal Ballroom was at the Mean Fiddler in London, supporting Sonic Youth, and it was packed. And the stage was only about this high, and my piano was right up the front, and there were people standing here, you know, just looking at me, and I'm sort of terrified. My hands were shaking. And then Harry had a technical problem. He forgot to turn his standby button on his amp off and thought his amp wasn't working. So for the first 10 minutes, everyone was just standing there staring. Rowland lay down on the stage and started talking to the crowd. And I just thought, no, please, make this over, make this over. And then when we started, I launched into the wrong song. And so my first big notes were played with great confidence, really loudly, on the wrong note. No one noticed, apparently. Nobody. nobody noticed. One awful thing, though, when you play that close to the people is I had a really beautiful bracelet and it flew off while I was playing, and someone just grabbed it. And then we went off and we had a few encores, which was good. But when we came back, Rowland's pedals were gone. So his first blue box was stolen at our first gig with These Immortal Souls. And the reviews for that were really good. They said, this is the next big thing. You heard it here, blah, blah, blah. We played a lot. We toured Europe. We had good fans in Austria and Germany and Holland. We'd go to Denmark and Sweden and Germany is a strange place. Berlin was wonderful. I loved it. It was so different from London. The people were interested. In London, I think there's so many people that people get this defence around them where they just blot everything out and they have to survive. They have to sit on a tube and just sort of go and pretend other people don't exist. And I think when a city gets to over a certain amount of millions of people, that's just probably par for the course. But in Berlin, it was the same size as Melbourne. It was about 2 million people in those days. And nice people, people who were friendly, who would talk to us, who could speak English, who would let us stay in their places, and who loved the band. People making a living. This was something we hadn't really seen before, people making a living out of music and art. And everyone we met there who was like an artist, or they were all making a living. There was this wonderful thing called the Culture Institute, which if you sang in German or you had Germans in your band, they would just subsidise you for everything. They'd pay for your tours. You could go touring Russia, you could tour Japan. So Einsturz into Neubauten and all these bands grew up, with this wonderful backing, which made so much difference. But the first time we went to Berlin, Lydia Lunch had met the birthday party when they played in New York and had fallen for Rowland and had come to London to get him, apparently. But then when she realised I could play piano, she asked me to play on her record. And we did a single together with Barry Adamson from Magazine, who was a wonderful man, and who is now in the Bad Seeds again. And anyway, she asked us to go to Berlin. So we went to Berlin to make a record with Lydia Lunch. And we got put up at a hotel where we demolished the bar, and it was wonderful. I loved it. There was an old lady in the next room, and I started talking to her one day, and she turned out to be an artist, and she was a girlfriend of George Gross, the German expressionist artist, and she was living in this hotel, and I'd go in and have coffee with her, and there was just a feeling of, oh, thank God, it's like home, but cooler. I think there were just difficulties about being a woman, full stop. It was it was a brutal time, A lot of the women had suffered, awful things when they were younger, as a lot of women do. I think it was more prevalent in those days, and, that you'd be, assaulted or whatever. And but mostly it was that you were always told what not to do as a woman. It was like the boys were the ones that were going to inherit the earth, and they were going to grow up and be doctors or this or that, or train drivers, or, guitarists or whatever. And in those days, it really was that women, you know, because I was born in the 50s and women were, you know, at school they said you could be a nurse or you could be a teacher and before you got married. And then if you were really clever, you could teach at university, and that was about it. My biology teacher wanted me to be a marine biologist. It never really appealed to me. But, and most of the bands that we saw were all men. The music I liked was mostly men. I loved Eno, David Bowie. There were no females yet in David Bowie's bands. That came later. There was Nico, but she was like the beautiful muse, mysterious, you know, renowned as much for her mysterious beauty as anything. And one thing I've noticed when people talk about people like Anita Lane from that time, they say she was really beautiful, you know, and you're judged according to how you looked, and that's your worth, you know. And the women were all really intelligent, I think, the girlfriends of this particular gang of boys. And we hated being called the girlfriends, you know. It's happened in books and whatever, sort of group noun, like a flock of girls, you know, I don't know. But Katie Beale paints. Anita was always an artist. She also has sung, you know, she's made records with Mick Harvey. Bronwyn Bonnie plays violin beautifully and sings beautifully. But I think we had problems. Just women were judged very harshly if they did get up and do something. I don't know, you know, and people say, oh, yes, but there was Patti Smith and there were the Slits and there was the Raincoats, but they were the exception. And so I think one thing I thought about the women was that we all thought that we had to be like 50 times better than the men before we'd get up and do anything. And I'm not quite sure where the psychology of that comes from. But I think it's just probably, you know, something we've had to fight in our own private battles with the way that we think about ourselves. The English were incredibly sexist, but then when I got back to Australia, I thought Australia was like that as well. And America was really bad. Like when you're on tour in America, I'd get on stage and the sound men, you know, would say, don't do that, you know, oh, leave that, I'll do it. The boys were allowed to plug in their own DI boxes or whatever, but if I went near one, I was going to blow it up. I don't know. They just... And whenever they saw me get on stage, they'd put a microphone in front of me and I'd say, no, I don't sing. And they were like, oh. But you know, being a keyboard player is much more, you know, female, unfortunately, and I didn't like that. But, you know, I banged my piano sometimes very hard in a very unfemale way. I was pretty good at playing piano, I think, and I could play guitar. And I was probably as technically good as, you know, some of the other guitarists. But when you don't play in a band, you don't develop, you know. So when I started playing with These Immortal Souls, you know, you just develop exponentially because you're playing, you know, so many nights a week and you just get better. You know, every live show you do, you get tighter and better and you get inspired. You think of things. There's a reason to do it while you're doing it. But personally, I was never happy then when I was on tour and playing live. I absolutely love it. You know, you're sort of in another zone. You know, you're thinking musically. You don't think about anything else. You're just completely submerged in the moment. You're interacting with other people and what they're doing. So you're listening to everything that other people are doing. and doing your thing, and you have to do it, and you have to do it well, and you have to do it then and there. And there's something, you know, particularly if it's music you really like, it's just an incredible feeling. But I had to be tricked, like on the first record that I did, the first single with Lydia Lunch, before we went to Berlin, we were in some studio somewhere in Chiswick or something. And Rowland said to me, Jen, it was for a song called Some Velvet Morning, and he said, just play through, we're not even going to listen, like, you know, just run through, just try some things out. We're not even listening. And they taped it, and that was that. And he tricked me into doing it. And I thought, oh, wow, that's pretty good, you know. But if I had known, you know, it was harder, I think. If I felt that pressure of, you know, I'd say, stop, and think that I'd made a mistake when I hadn't or whatever. And one thing I thought about the boys at that time was that, you know, when punk first started, people were just picking up instruments everywhere. They didn't have to be any good at all. And yet the women, you know, didn't feel like they could do that as much. But I still wanted to be good, and I think I'm probably a perfectionist in that way. So I don't know. It's a dreadful thing to be. You know, because nothing's ever perfect, and perfect would be really boring anyway. But yeah, it did give me confidence, and, you know, particularly touring, playing live, playing with other people. Rowland and I lived in London from beginning of 1980 to 95. Lived in Berlin, you know, in 1982, and Rowland went to New Orleans in 92. But yeah, basically, yeah, we came back in the 90s. We came back because Rowland's mother had Alzheimer's. My parents were getting older, but it was mostly to do with Rowland's mother and just the struggle of living in London. The rents are, you know, it's, if you're not making a lot of money as a musician, it's a very unforgiving place. The winters were bleak. And, you know, there's beautiful things about England and London and really exciting things, but it can be a really difficult place to live. And I think we were just missing good coffee and family. And Rowland had come back for Christmas about 6 months before we moved back, and had formed a fake These Immortal Souls and toured with them to make some money. But it had gone really well with Spencer Jones and, yeah, so Chris Walsh. And so he thought that, you know, we'd be able to play. But our drummer, Chris Hughes, lived in Berlin, so that was difficult. When we first got back, we were deemed an overseas band, so we got paid accordingly. And then when it became clear that we were just another Melbourne band, and it was a bad time, the 90s. People didn't like rock music as they do again now. Everything was DJs and, you know, horrible doof-doof. Yeah, rock music was really not, you know, pulling crowds, and the money just kept going down and down and down. So when we first got back, say we'd get $2,000 or something, and then, you know, by 2 years later, we were down to, you know, 600 or something. So after a while, you know, you pay for rehearsals, you pay for whatever, you know, and you have to get your amp fixed and this and that, and get my bloody piano somewhere. That was always, it's horrible being a keyboard player because I have a lead-weighted keyboard. And at the end of every show, it's like, who wants to help me with my piano? Everyone disappears. But yeah, it wasn't, you know, it seemed to be going with a whimper. We're just slowly winding down. That was really disheartening. And then as soon as we say we're breaking up, everyone, we have a sold out show, and that was wonderful, but apparently we were far too loud. Yeah, it was painful. I played with Conrad Standish and Tom Carline in a band called the Devastations for a bit, and Luxido, I think they were called actually at the time. Sorry, they became the Devastations later. I played with, Rowland on Teenage Snuff Film, and he covered one of my songs, if you can call it covering. Yeah. He wrote a chorus for it, so it's not really, can't say it's a cover. It's a co-written song. The thing I've enjoyed the most was doing Rowland songs and These Immortal Souls songs. That thing called Pop Crimes, which we did in 2014, which seems like years ago now. But it was a big group extravaganza. So it had Janine from Hate Rock and Adelita and Ed Cooper and Penny Eichinger and Brian Hooper and everybody playing with us. And in various combinations, we did all the songs from Rowland's life, from Young Charlatans, Boys Next Door, Birthday Party, Crime in the City Solution, These Immortal Souls, Teenage Snuff Film and Pop Crimes. And I was on stage for all of it except a few songs at the beginning in the Young Charlatans. And so I was on stage for about 3 hours a night, and my knuckles were all getting weird, and I had to have steroid injections in my knuckles to keep playing. It's horrible getting old. And I played guitar in a song called Shut Me Down of Rowland's, which is just like this big, angry guitar solo at the end. And I got to play guitar in that, and that was so much fun. I'm the executor of the Rowland S. Howard estate, and I decided not long ago, really, to donate Rowland's guitar to the Performing Arts Collection. It wasn't really a very difficult decision for me. I'm very happy for it to be there. Rowland really didn't like other people playing it that much. He sort of told me to throw it in with him, but couldn't do that. Didn't want to do that. You can't divide it into bits, and and yet it was a sort of, it was a worry, like what if I was burgled twice and I was completely cleaned out of all records, memorabilia, everything to do with Rowland. It was a Rowland-orientated burglary, and that's still really hard to cope with. And I think people love to be near objects that have done something wonderful in a person's life or being played by someone wonderful. I think people love looking at other people's things. And I don't really feel good about other people playing it. I think it's almost sacrilege, which might be being a bit precious, but I think the Performing Arts Collection will look after it beautifully, and it will be available for everyone to see if they want to. And it will be looked after, and it won't end up sold or lost or burgled. And it'll always be Rowland's guitar. Rowland and I were a strange pair. We were, I would call us adult lifetime friends. We were together from 78 to 94, but when we broke up, we kept living together until 97. And then we both had other relationships, and they both ended around the same time, and Rowland was getting homeless, so he asked me if he could stay at my place, and then we lived together until he died as very good friends. I think, we weren't always good for each other because of the things that we'd, done together in our lives, and drugs and things like that. And but once we got past that, the basic connection was still always there. I think it was weird for other people, but yeah, we just understood each other on some very basic level, and we shared a lot of taste, and it was just that wonderful knowledge of Rowland could walk in the door and tell who I was talking to on the phone by the sound of my voice, that sort of just knowledge of someone, in London with Nicky Sudden, walking back across a field after recording all this beautiful slidey music. And I'd been playing the harmonium, and there was this huge red harvest moon, and it was just pitch black, and we were staying in a funny little old cottage. It's like something out of Toad and Toad Hall or something, but it was just beautiful. And you could really feel that you were on a planet, and that you were in a solar system, and that it was vast and unknowable, and it was really inspiring and very beautiful.